Recording.
Hi folks, this is Randy Westbrook with Invasive Plant Control in Whiteville, North Carolina. It's so good to be with you today. Today we want to talk about early detection and rapid response and some of the strategies that Steve Manning and I have developed over the past 15 years. I've been working with Steve since 1998, and he's become a national leader and working on invasive plant management in natural areas. And one thing you're going to find that's really unique about the company now is that they have new web solutions and smart tools that allow you to do project management in unbelievable ways. And you can find out about these tools by some of the webinars that Steve and the folks in the company are putting on, and you can go to IPC Web Solutions and get a list of those kinds of webinars. But we have IPC Connect for inventory, IPC Connect for projects, IPC Plans and Logic, and the one that I'm working on is IPC Prevent, which is for EDR. So we're talking about the landscape approach to early detection and rapid response today, and I see this as the most cost-effective strategy for managing new invaders at all levels of the landscape, from local to national. This is actually the first of a 5-part series of webinars on EDR that we have scheduled over the next few days. The first one being an introduction and overview today. We're going to have one this time next week on partnership development. Then we do early detection, data management, and reporting to state agencies and federal agencies. Then strategies and methods for rapid assessment. And finally, an overview of the methods we've developed over the years for rapid response. The other thing we have got going on this spring is a new webinar series, a 9-part webinar series on invasive species prevention that is really based on a workshop that Steve, my wife, and I did for the Global Invasive Species Program in East Africa in 2006. This is a 9-part webinar series that is going to give you the inside look at port of entry exclusion of invasive species. So we're trying to connect prevention and port of entry exclusion with EDRs, with prevention work at the port being the first line of defense and EDR being the second line of defense against introduced invasive species. So what I want to start out with today is just to make this as personal as I can for you, because we've always worked at the state and national level over the past 15 years, and really it was last year that we began to think that we could apply these concepts that we've been working on through these years with the individual land units. And so I want you to think a minute about the land that you own and manage, and think about how it relates to the rest of the country. So there's about 13 million landowners in our country, and so we have about 61% private land and about 39% public lands. Out of 2.3 billion acres, that amounts to about 1.4 billion acres of private land. So there's a lot of opportunity for folks to get involved with the EDR. So the kind of questions that I want you to be thinking about as I go through this presentation is: what kind of land unit or waterway do you or your clients own or manage? How big is it? How many acres? What are your goals? Now, there's another fact, and there's about 1,300 introduced invasive plants in the United States, according to John Cortez of the Biota of North America program in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So of these 1,300 species, do any of these things interfere with the goals that you have for this land? And what are your worst weed problems? How does this compare with neighboring landowners? How do you manage those problems? And what kind of new weeds have you noticed lately? And a start fact that the reason I think EDR is so important is while we only have 1,300 species here that are introduced that are causing problems, there's 31,759 species that are around the world that we do not have here. And that is according to Rod Randall, who's our premier world weed geographer in Western Australia. So I want you to think about those two numbers. We've only begun to homogenize the world flora and fauna, And in another 100 years, unless we figure out something different than what we're doing now in terms of prevention and EDRR, we're going to be inundated in a way that we can't even imagine in these days. So based on what you're doing right now, what I want you to think about is what's your land going to look like in about 100 years or 500 years, and what can you do to change that, to make it better. So here's a fact. In 100 years, in 2012, 2013, this land is going to belong to somebody else. So it's your land for now. Now, I began my career in the Port of Charleston in 1979, so this is actually a very special day for me, January 29th, 2013. It was 34 years ago this morning that I drove from Columbia, South Carolina, down to Charleston to take my first federal job as a port officer, a plant protection and quarantine officer for USDA APHIS. So at the Port of Charleston, as soon as I arrived that morning, they gave me several tools and said, let's go down to the port, a hatchet and a chisel and a flashlight, and I was really sort of amazed at this, that I could have a master's degree and I was going to be chopping wood. And I learned really fast that this is exactly what you have to do to prevent the introduction of these insects and diseases they were so worried about back in those days. So in 1986, I decided to take a job up here in North Carolina working on weed eradication programs like the witchweed eradication program, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So I really started in the Port of Charleston in 1979, moved up here in 86, and so the rest is history, as they say. But before I move on into what I want to tell you about EDRR today, I want to recognize three people that really have taught me so much over these past 34 years. That's Bob Epley, who was my supervisor here at the Whiteville Plant Methods Center from 1986 until he retired in 2000, and then Bill Gregg, who was my supervisor with the U.S. Geological Survey, who I worked for from 2000 until he retired in 2005. And then Stephen Manning, who is the president of our company, who I first met in 1998 at a meeting of Southeast EPSI in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I got to tell you that these three folks have meant so much to me in so many ways. And if you want to learn anything about invasive species, these are three people that you can go to. They're the people that have really helped me understand this. And so a lot of what you're going to hear today, really, we worked on together, these three folks. So anyway, in those early days, working with Dr. Epley, I was really working on a single agency-led federal state weed eradication program, such as the witchweed eradication program. This is the same kind of work that Al Tasker does, who's the APHIS National Weed Program Coordinator, and also Rick Iverson, who's the state weed coordinator in North Carolina. They are both working on single agency-led programs. In other words, these are generally regulated species. Some more species we worked on back in those days in the mid-'80s was goat's rue, which is a legume in Utah, 40,000 acres, and Japanese dodder, which was about 2 acres in the Clemson University Arboretum in 1991. These are examples of single agency-led programs. A little bit later in 1998, after I started working with Bill Gregg and the folks in the Department of Interior, we started looking at other ways to expand the scope of what we were doing from single agency-led programs into interagency task forces. And this is what we call EDRR 2.0. And so examples of that include the Delaware Invasive Species Council, which we're now working with to develop a state early detection system there, and the Carolinas Beach Vitex Task Force, which we started working with in 2003 to eradicate beach vitex from the Carolina coast. The difference between the witchweed program and the beach vitex program is that beach vitex involves about 20 agencies, whereas the witchweed program involves about 1 to 2 agencies. And primarily in North Carolina, it is now North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and the funding comes through USDA APHIS. That's what we call EDRR 2.0. Now, after I retired in 2012 last year, I started working with Steve Manning in our company, Invasive Plant Control. And he encouraged me to take these concepts we had developed in EDRR 1.0 and 2.0 and develop new ways and new strategies to work with people at the local level. And so now what we're doing is developing the landscape approach to EDRR, which is EDRR 3.0, which means we take the same concepts we applied at the state and federal level, and we apply them down there at the county and local levels. So here's what it's going to look like. We're going to have county level systems such as the ones that Bob Parsons might develop in Park County, Wyoming for his county. In other words, if he finds a new weed in that county, he's going to get rid of it regardless of whether you can eradicate it from the state of Wyoming. The focus of Bob Parsons is that county. And the same would be true if you're in a city park or in a farm or anything else. The idea is this is your kingdom, whether you work on public lands or private lands, parks, forests, refuges, lakes, and streams. Just think of where you are. Where are you right now in terms of land management? You're at one of these levels. If you're Al Tasker, you're national. If you are Rick Iverson, you are state. If you are Bob Parsons, you are county level. There are people then who work in national parks, national forests. What we want to do is take the concepts today and have you apply them on the land that you own or manage, even if it's your backyard. And I mean literally if it is your farm, ranch, or a nature preserve, or if it's your backyard, because that's what you have control over. And that is what we mean by the landscape approach to EDRR. It is really nothing different than what we were always doing. It's just we never applied it down at the local level until now. So we take our concepts that we've been working on for the past 30 to 40 years, and we now offer them to you as a way to make sure that in 50 years there's not a single new weed on your land. We're not here to solve all your weed problems, but this concept will make sure that there's never any new weeds ever again. That is the goal on your land. So my question is, where do you fit in this picture? Now, there's two things that we want to help you think about for just a minute before we launch off into the 7-step process for developing EDRR capacity at any level of the landscape, and that is the relationship between EDRR as a management strategy and between that and food security and climate change. First of all, this is not a new idea. People have been using EDRR to protect their food security for generations, for literally hundreds to thousands of years. We've always used manual weed control. And when my dad was growing up in upstate South Carolina, he always said you've got to get out there early in the day to get rid of these things, especially new things, before they get established. But what happened after World War II was with economic pest control strategies, with chemical, manual, and biological control, it greatly reduced cost and labor and greatly increased production. It's really the way we are able to feed 7 billion people on this planet. The minuses, if there are any, with this economic approach to pest control is it has a false sense of security about low invasive species populations like weeds. We sort of ignore them if they're below a certain level, which lets them grow and never really get addressed. And it also created herbicide resistance, as we all know about what is happening with glyphosate. So in the future, I'd really like for us to think about 4 pest control strategies. If we could do this, I think we would do a lot better with manual, chemical, biological, and EDRR. I think we have to include EDRR as one of our main strategies. It doesn't take the place of all these others, but it certainly is one we can no longer afford to ignore. It's something we need to embrace again as our ancestors did. And that's my dad there with, we call him the Rocky Ford plowboy from upstate South Carolina. And he certainly hoed weeds in the early part of his life and taught me a lot about this. But my point is, I want you to think about what kind of weeds you have right now and what's it going to be like in about 10 or 15 years. The other thing I want to mention is climate change. This is something that I feel like is going to really raise up and bite us even more than we think about right now, because um, in the past, 100 years ago, something like kudzu would never have a chance of getting established and growing in Canada. It was just too cold up there. But we now have a thriving population of kudzu in Ontario, Canada. It's actually on the north shore of Lake Erie, southeast of Detroit, but it is still in Canada. It's amazing that it's there. So I think that we have one more factor that we have to consider now when we do management. We can no longer just take comfort that it is too cold in Pennsylvania for invasive species like kudzu to grow. They're going to grow there, and in 100 years, there's no telling what it's going to be like. So I would say climate change and food security are two issues that make us think that EDRR is even more critical than, it's not just a good idea, it's a really critical idea. Anyway, but I want to give you a really personal example today of something that, and try to imagine that you're here at this situation with us in Lake Waccamaw. We have a state park here, Carolina Bay. It's the largest of 500,000 Carolina bays between New Jersey and Florida. We have 500,000 of these. This is the largest of those. This is a state park. The lake is almost 9,000 acres. We have just found hydrilla in this lake, but we found it 3 or 4 years too late to really immediately go out and eradicate it. It's going to take about 10 to 15 years to do this. So I want you to put yourself in their place and think about, what could we have done 5 years ago to stop the introduction and spread of hydrilla into this lake? So when we first found it in October in last year, we did some surveys and figured out that it was in about 608 acres. And so we've started doing some work with North Carolina State University and the state DNR agency here, and they're predicting that unless we do something now, this 9,000-acre lake is going to be pretty much covered in 10 to 15 years. So we've launched a program to try to eradicate this, but it's going to take quite a long time and probably about $5 million to do it. So as we're sitting and looking at each other across the table, all I can think of is this is a prime example of what we find ourselves in these situations and think, why did this have to happen? Why did it happen? And it's very clear that somebody brought this here on a boat from somewhere in the Carolinas, and we're going to have to deal with it. But I want to use this as an example of what can happen, but also how easy it would be to do an effective monitoring program over time and make sure that this never happens again. Because the thing we have down in South Carolina that's going to come here, the plant, is called crested floating heart. And I've told them about this, and I said we need a monitoring program on this lake so that while we're dealing with hydrilla, spending all this money, then we're going to actually be looking for crested floating heart, which is a beautiful little plant that occupies about 6,000 acres of Lake Marion and Moultrie down near Charleston in South Carolina. Out of that, 2 lakes, 160,000 acres, and it's really one boat ride away from coming here. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today, is what are the strategies and the steps you take to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. So the 7 steps are: get organized, put more eyes on the ground, look around, manage your field data, tell somebody, report it, assess the problem, and do something about it. That's really what it comes down to. So we want a work plan, we want an early detection network, we want field survey guidelines, phone apps to submit your data to places like EdMaps at the University of Georgia. Report these things to state and federal agencies if you need to. Do rapid assessment of new things if there's no history of it, like there was no history with beach vitex. And then finally, do something about it. This is what IPC would like to work with you to develop for the lands that you manage and own. So first of all, we want to identify all the stakeholders. And we're going to have a a webinar about this, specific about partnership development next week, in which we want to identify the impacted and potential stakeholders and organize meetings to get these people together to make sure that we have everybody on board so that we can move ahead. And that's exactly what we've done with the Lake Waccamaw situation. We've had 3 meetings so far, and we're going to have a technical advisory committee meeting again on February the 8th to move forward and figure what we're going to do about our control program this summer, which is going to cost about $450,000. So I want you to keep that in mind as you're listening to me, is these people here, because we didn't do EDR, are now faced with a $450,000 tab or cost of control for managing hydrilla in this 9,000-acre lake. And it's going to happen. They're going to find the money. The state has already allocated $200,000, but the local folks have to come up with $250,000. So can't you just imagine what we could do with $450,000 if we didn't have to spend it on this? And that is my point. For everything I'm talking about, it's just the opportunity cost that we have associated with these programs that don't have to be. This is not rocket science. It is not hard. If we can get people interested in preventing these things, then we can make sure that we can spend that money someplace else where it's really needed. Second thing we want to do is make a work plan. In North Carolina, at our state level system, we have an EDR committee. At the local level, we have a state level or a local level coordinating committee made up of Lake Waccamaw State Park, the town, NCDA, North Carolina State, Southeastern Community College, and our company, Invasive Plant Control. And what we need to do at each of these places in this work plan for the area that you're concerned about, in our case, it's Lake Waccamaw State Park. In North Carolina, it's obviously the whole state. What can we eradicate from North Carolina, number one? Number two, what can we eradicate specifically just from Lake Waccamaw? In this case, it's hydrilla. Number three, what are the things you're worried about? In the state, we have a number of things we're worried about we want to protect. At Lake Waccamaw, we have a number of endemic species, including the Waccamaw silver-side minnow, which grows nowhere else in the world except this lake and the river, just right down the river that flows out of the lake down to the Carolina coastal plain. This is what's at risk, and for the folks who are in the Wildlife Resource Commission, they are just very concerned about our native species that are going to be put at risk because of hydrilla being here. And it's why they're so serious about getting rid of it. But I keep saying this did not have to happen. This did not have to happen. It does not have to happen again. When we go on to step number two, we put more eyes on the ground. We identify our potential early detection network members. In the case of Lake Waccamaw, we have Friends of Parks. We have Native Plant Society members from this part of the state who love to go into the green swamp and look for Venus flytrap plants. We have local and state agency field personnel who are out all the time. There are any number of people who are associated with Lake Waccamaw who need to be trained for the things that we are concerned about, like crested floating heart, like hydrilla, like elodea, those kind of things. Then we're going to do some training workshops for network members, lake residents and boaters, the same kind of training that Les Meerhoff and Sarah Trainer-Bois from University of Connecticut did to develop the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England over the past 15 years. Next thing to do is, once you get this network of people, is to create a listserv and start sending out information to them, the kind of information we're now sending out to people who are all around Lake Waccamaw and the people who use it as an area to do recreation and to fish and things like that. We want them to know about hydrilla, and we don't want them to spread it anywhere else. We have a lake that's 30 miles north of here. It could go there tomorrow on a boat if we're not careful. Step three is to do these surveys of high-value resources and to start recording this information so that we know more about what is going on. So here we have managed resources and natural resources. In the case of Lake Waccamaw, we consider this a natural area resource. And we can use any number of weed survey methods: general detection surveys, delimiting surveys, and appraisal surveys. In the witchweed program here, we had walking surveys, we had platform surveys, and we use even horseback surveys. We actually used the whole lake sonar survey to map the bottom of Lake Waccamaw in November 2012 to figure out exactly where it was, and that's how we came up with 608-acre level of infestation. But if you're in much larger areas, the folks at Utah State University and other folks in out west have developed survey methods for large land units like the wildland weed survey methods, parallel swaths, contour swaths, digital aerial sketch mapping with aircraft. And then, so finally then, when you get your information after you do these surveys, it needs to be put into an online database. And in the case of the Southeast especially, we generally put our information into the University of Georgia Early Detection Distribution Mapping System that is maintained by the university. And you can do online field data entry just directly from your computer. But they have these phone apps, which I really like to use. I use the one called I've Got One, which was actually developed for the folks in Florida and also the Southeast Early Detection Network. Phone app, which you can actually put information directly from your phone into the database at the University of Georgia, into EdMaps. They also have one for the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States, and also now for IPANE for the Northeast. So once you get all your information and you start thinking about how you're going to manage that, that is where I would like for you to talk to Steve Manning and Lee Patrick in our company. Because what they have already done is developed IPC Connect, which will help you manage all your project information. And then when you go to actually do control programs, IPC Logic actually gives you recommendations for controlling certain weeds in certain kinds of places. And what I'm developing right now is IPC Prevent, which is going to take the information in this particular webinar and put it into a phone app or into a smart tool that we can actually develop our work plans for early detection systems, especially local early detection systems. So once you find something, the next thing you want to do is to find out if it's something new, is it something that is a new state record or a new national record. You need to report this to the State Department of Agriculture and perhaps the DNR. If it's a confirmed state or federal noxious weed, you definitely need to call those folks and just let them know. That's exactly what happened when a county agent here in Pender County over in, which is not too far from here. We're down here. This is the site of the new infestation of Cogon grass in Pender County, which was found last May. So she called Rick Iverson in Raleigh with NCDA, and we convened a group of people out there, and they're now actually starting to eradicate it. This is a great example of getting people to report something into the appropriate officials in the state that you're actually living in, if it's regulated. Step 6 is to assess the problem, and so we're going to have a rapid assessment webinar to go through the specific kinds of assessment systems that you can use to figure out if you've got a problem and what you ought to do about it. And so we've got general rapid assessment guidelines for suspected new species that haven't already been assessed. You can use the one that APHIS has developed, which is a weed risk assessment system to see if a species should be listed as a federal noxious weed. And you can also use the Australian system. So in that webinar coming up here in about 3 weeks, we will be talking about the Australian weed risk assessment system as well as the APHIS weed risk assessment in more detail. So there's actually 3 things we're going to cover in that particular webinar coming up in about 3 weeks. So finally then, when you get down to control and eradication, if you're using these smart tools that Steve and Lee Patrick and others have developed, it's going to let you move forward with actually getting rid of something on your land that maybe you would have just tried to manage in the past. But when you do this, there's going to be about 4 things that are going to happen if you decide to do this. It's either going to be a single agency-led weed eradication program like the witchweed program has been here for the last 55 years, which we've eradicated over 431,000 acres of witchweed from an area in North Carolina and South Carolina in the coastal plain. Or perhaps you want to do an interagency task force like the Giant Salvinia task force we had here from 2002 until 2010, in which we eradicated Giant Salvinia from North Carolina in about 6 different sites, with the last one being finished in 2010. Perhaps you have a weed management area like the Southport Weed Management Area in Park County, Wyoming, in which you're going to think about eradicating a new weed from a geographic area like a watershed, which is exactly geographic based. And so that is another way to do it. And the last thing, though, is when you have a local weed eradication project, like on an individual land unit or a lake like the Waccamaw Hydrilla Task Force. When you do this, it's going to be one of these 4 kinds of approaches for control and eradication of incipient infestations. So here's some ideas I want you to think about when you get to that point and you decide, well, we're going to have a local weed eradication program like the Waccamaw project here. First of all, I want you to involve all impacted stakeholders. In other words, to do detection surveys or anything else like that. Because a major issue with the witchweed program here is the farmers never have really had much of a role in this thing. It was done by the government, so they had no incentive for us to ever stop. They love us coming out doing all this control work on their land. It's really great for them. But if they had some responsibility, I think it might have ended a lot sooner than 55 years. Second question is ask some hard questions. Identify the roadblocks to success. An example of this should have been asked in 1981 in the Goat Shrew Eradication Program, which is a federal state program funded by USDA APHIS for 15 years for about $150,000 a year. The one thing, and then finally when the congressional earmark was lifted in 1996, the program just folded. And the fact is there was nobody there to work with Utah State University to go get funding anyplace else. They were sort of on their own, so it never worked. But the one thing looking back that I think should have been asked about this is what might keep us from achieving success. The reason we were successful with witchweed is because we developed ethylene to actually cause suicidal germination of the seeds in the soil, which is a rare thing to find for a plant like that. In terms of goat shrew, I don't know anything that would cause the seeds to germinate. In fact, the seeds last 50 years in the soil. So you've got to really ask the question, are we going to be around in 50 years to be working on this thing? And so that might give you an idea that we should think about a control program for goat shrew rather than an eradication program for goat shrew. If we could eradicate it, we should, but if we can't, we have to be realistic. When you start doing control work, eliminate the satellite infestations first. Do everything you can to stop reproduction in those sites. Eliminate the seed bank in the soil. This is actually the ethylene injector that was developed here by Dr. Bob Epley at the Whiteville Lab in the early 90s. And this, as I said, and this is the way they injected it in tall corn. This is the one thing that made the witchweed program work. Without this, I don't think it could have ever worked. You could never get all these tiny, tiny seeds to ever germinate, because they won't germinate till a corn root or a grass root grows within like a millimeter of the seed. Then take steps to prevent movement from the eradication zone through soil contact commodities, and of course you've got to clean your vehicles and equipment. And this applies to any land unit that you're working on here. So now here's witchweed seeds, those tiny little seeds. Then we got mustard seeds, and we got tobacco seeds. And these are human hairs. So you can see just how small these seeds are. They can be under your fingernails, and they feel like dirt. So in summary, we have 7 steps for developing EDR capacity on the lands that you own or manage. We want you to get organized, put more eyes on the ground, look around, manage your field data, report this stuff, tell somebody, assess the problem, and take action. Eradicate everything you can. Now, you can do this as an in-house program of volunteers or dedicated staff, or you can outsource this to a company like Invasive Plant Control. Either way, the most important thing is that we don't need any more weeds in our country. Just remember what I said about the 31,000 weeds that are all around the world. We got 1,300 of them. And my question to you today is, I want you to write this down. I want you to ask the question: how many more do we need? How many more of the 31,000 do we need? The answer is no, none. So my question is, what are we going to do about it? And I'm really hoping that people will say, no more. We're going to draw a line in the sand, and we don't want any more new weeds in this country. None. We got enough to deal with. It's already costing us billions and billions. We're losing money all the time because of the ones we have. So now, the answer's up to you. I mean, you may be at the national level. More than likely, everybody that I've seen on the list of people that were supposed to take the sign up today were from local. They're from local agencies or they're local land units in national or state agencies. So this land is your land, and the question is, what is your land going to look like in 25 years? This is up to you. Is it going to look like we're going to have one weed now that's going to become a massive infestation? Or are you going to have no new weeds in 2038? And it's really up to us as what we do now, because I can tell you, if you do nothing, you're going to have a lot more weeds than you do right now. February 19th, we'll talk about a rapid assessment methods, and then finally we'll focus on rapid response on the 26th. And then our prevention webinar series, it's a 9-part webinar series starting on February 7th, once a week until April 18th. And I can send you a list of topics that are going to be covered in that particular webinar series.